"Don't open that door," my son's neighbor said quietly as I raised my hand to knock. 3 hours later, I was standing in a hospital room I never expected to enter, and nothing about my family would ever be the same again. I hadn't planned to drive to Phoenix that weekend. My wife had been staying with our son Brandon and his wife Nicole for 10 days, and for the first 8, everything seemed fine. Short texts, a few photos of the backyard garden Nicole had been working on, the occasional voice message from my wife, saying she was resting well and enjoying the slower pace. Margaret had been dealing with a stubborn chest infection through most of September, and the dry Arizona air was supposed to help her breathe easier than the humidity back home in Savannah. Then the messages stopped. Not gradually, not with any explanation, just stopped. 2 days of silence from a woman who had texted me good morning every single day for 41 years of marriage. I called Brandon on Thursday evening. His phone rang 5 times and dropped to voicemail. I tried Nicole. Same result. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe they'd gone somewhere without reception. Maybe Margaret had left her phone in the car and was napping. I'd spent 34 years practicing internal medicine, and I knew better than most people how easy it was to catastrophize a silence. Patients' families did it every day in my office. I would not do it to myself. By Friday noon, with still no response to 4 texts and 2 voicemails, I was in my car heading west on I-20. The drive from Savannah to Phoenix is 19 hours if you push it. I stopped twice for gas and coffee, kept the radio off, and let my mind work through the possibilities the way I used to work through a differential diagnosis. Chest infection lingering. Reaction to a new antibiotic. Margaret sleeping more than usual. Brandon and Nicole overwhelmed with hosting and simply forgetting to respond. Each explanation felt plausible and insufficient at the same time. I arrived in their neighborhood just after 11 Saturday morning. Brandon and Nicole lived in a newer development on the east side of the city, the kind of place where every house had the same tan stucco exterior, and a 2-car garage, and a xeriscape yard full of gravel and drought-resistant plants. Their house was at the end of a quiet street. Both cars were in the driveway. The blinds were drawn against the desert sun. I parked at the curb, walked up the front path, and had just raised my hand to knock when the door of the house next door opened. "Don't open that door." The voice was calm, careful, not a shout. I turned. A woman in her late 50s stood on the neighboring porch. Silver hair cut short, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a coffee mug held in both hands. Her expression was the kind that people get when they've been rehearsing something difficult. "Are you Margaret's husband?" she asked. "The doctor from Georgia?" The fact that she knew those 2 things about me before I'd said a single word made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with my own health. "I'm Arthur Caldwell," I said. "Yes." She came down off her porch and crossed the narrow strip of gravel between the properties. "My name is Helen Marsh. I've been trying to decide what to do for 2 days." She looked at the drawn blinds on Brandon's house, and then back at me. "I think you need to hear some things before you go in there." She told me quickly, in the efficient way of someone who had organized her words carefully. 9 days ago, which was the night after Margaret arrived, Helen had heard sounds through the shared wall between the houses. Her office was on that side, and the walls were thin in these developments. She heard Margaret's voice, not words exactly, but a tone, confused, frightened, and then Brandon's voice, lower, reassuring, saying, "Mom, you're just tired. It's the elevation. It's the dry air. You need to rest." The next morning, Helen had seen Margaret through the back fence. My wife was moving very slowly across the yard, one hand trailing along the fence for balance. Helen had called out to say hello, and Margaret had looked up with an expression that Helen described as not quite right, distant, like she was trying to locate herself. Helen had knocked on Brandon's door that afternoon and asked if Margaret was okay. Nicole answered. "Everything was fine," she said. Margaret's chest infection had settled in, and the doctor had adjusted her blood pressure medication. She was resting. They were monitoring her. There was no need for concern. But 2 days after that, on Wednesday, Helen had seen the paramedics. She'd heard the ambulance before she saw it. Came out to her porch and watched 2 EMTs go into Brandon's house with a chair stretcher. Watched them come back out 7 minutes later with Margaret in it. Margaret's head was rolling to one side. Her color was gray. Brandon and Nicole stood in the doorway and watched the ambulance leave without getting in it. They didn't follow her? I heard my own voice come out flat, diagnostic, processing. They went back inside, Helen said. I called out to them and asked which hospital. Nicole said Mercy General and that it wasn't as serious as it looked, just a medication interaction, and that they'd go check on her in a bit. Helen pressed her lips together. I've been watching their house since then. Neither car has moved. I had my phone out before she finished the sentence. I called Mercy General, worked through 3 different departments until I reached the nursing supervisor on the cardiac floor. Gave my name, gave Margaret's name, identified myself as her husband and as a physician. She was there, admitted Wednesday morning. Serious but stable. What's her presentation? I asked, because old habits don't leave you just because you're retired. Sir, I can't give details over the phone. You'll need to come in and speak with her attending. I'm 20 minutes away. I was already moving toward my car. Helen called after me with the address and told me she'd be available if I needed anything. I thanked her without looking back. My focus had already narrowed to one fixed point. At the hospital, I found Margaret on the 4th floor, in a room with 2 other patients. She was awake when I walked in, which undid something inside me that I'd been holding rigid for 19 hours of driving. Her eyes found mine and filled immediately. Arthur. Just my name, but she said it the way you say a word you thought you'd lost. I pulled a chair close and took both her hands. Her grip was weaker than it should have been. Her color was still off, a grayish pallor I knew from years of practice and had never wanted to see on my wife's face. Her attending physician was a cardiologist named Dr. Reyes, a precise, careful woman who met with me in the hallway while a nurse sat with Margaret. Dr. Reyes laid out the situation without softening it. Margaret had been admitted with dangerously elevated levels of metoprolol in her system. Metoprolol was one of the medications she'd been taking for her blood pressure for 6 years. She took 50 milligrams a day. Her toxicology on admission showed levels consistent with 2 to 3 times that dose, sustained over multiple days. Is she on a different formulation? I asked. Extended release? Did someone change her prescription? Dr. Reyes shook her head slowly. That's what we're trying to determine. The levels we found aren't consistent with a one-time accidental double dose. They suggest ongoing, elevated intake. She paused. Mr. Caldwell. Her prescription bottle was brought in with her personal belongings. The pills inside are a higher dosage than what's printed on the label. I stood very still in that hallway, while the implication arranged itself into something I could see clearly. Someone had replaced the pills, not dropped the wrong bottle in her bag, not confused 2 medications. Replaced the pills inside a labeled bottle with a higher dose than what Margaret thought she was taking. She'd been taking what she believed was her normal 50 milligram dose every morning and receiving 150 instead. For 9 days, that level of sustained overdose in a patient her age with her cardiac history, I said carefully. What's the risk profile? Dr. Reyes looked at me directly. Significant. We're treating her for beta blocker toxicity. She's responding, but she required intervention for bradycardia twice in the first 24 hours. I thanked her and went back to Margaret's room. I sat beside her and we talked quietly while the monitors beeped their steady rhythm. I asked her to tell me everything she remembered from the past 10 days. She told me about the first 2 days, which had been pleasant. Dinners on the back patio, a drive to see the botanical garden, Nicole bringing her tea in the mornings. Then, around day 3, she'd started feeling unsteady, dizzy when she stood, short of breath climbing stairs. She'd mentioned it to Brandon, and he'd said the elevation was affecting her, that Phoenix was over 1,000 feet higher than Savannah, and her body needed time to adjust. She'd accepted that. It seemed reasonable. By day 5, she'd been spending most of the day in the guest room, tired in a way she couldn't account for. She'd tried to call me one evening, she said, but her phone had died and she couldn't find her charger anywhere in the room. I asked Nicole for a charger, Margaret said. She said she'd find one and bring it. She never did. Her phone, a dead phone that stayed dead for 5 days. My wife, who had texted me good morning every day for 4 decades. I thought about that charger for a long moment. Then I picked up my own phone and called the Phoenix Police Department. The officer I spoke with was professional and thorough. I explained who I was, explained Margaret's admission, explained what Dr. Reyes had told me about the pill bottle, and gave him Brandon's address. He told me someone would come to take my statement at the hospital, and that depending on what I reported, they might want to speak with her attending physician as well. I went back to Margaret. She was sleeping, finally, her breathing more even than when I'd arrived. I sat in the chair beside her and did not leave. By 4 that afternoon, I had spoken twice with Detective Paul Okafor, a methodical man in his early 40s who asked his questions in a careful sequence and wrote everything down in a notebook he balanced on one knee. He had already been to Brandon's address before coming to the hospital. Brandon and Nicole were home. Both had been advised that the pill bottle was being submitted for analysis. Their position, Detective Okafor said, is that your wife became confused about her medication schedule while visiting, that she may have taken additional doses herself because she was worried about her chest infection. They say they noticed she seemed unwell, but she insisted she was fine, and they respected her autonomy. She couldn't find a phone charger for 5 days, I said. Okafor wrote something down. That's worth pursuing. My wife is one of the most methodical people I have ever known. She has taken the same blood pressure medication at the same time every morning for 6 years. She has never once doubled a dose. I kept my voice level the way I'd kept it level in rooms where I had to tell families terrible things. The pills inside her bottle are not her prescription. Someone put them there. Okafor nodded. We'll need a search warrant to go further. What you've given me, combined with the hospital's toxicology findings, is enough for me to request one. He closed his notebook. In the meantime, I'd ask that you not contact your son or daughter-in-law directly. I told him I understood. That night, after Margaret slept and the hospital floor quieted, I sat in the dim room and let myself think about Brandon. He was 42 years old. He had a master's degree in finance that Margaret and I had paid for. He had a house that we'd helped with the down payment on when he and Nicole married 6 years ago. He coached youth soccer on weekends and had a laugh that filled a room, a laugh that I'd heard since he was 3 years old. I thought about the last year of phone calls, the shifts in conversation that I had noticed but had attributed to stress, the questions about our estate plan, Brandon asking, with what had seemed like reasonable curiosity, whether we had a financial advisor or if we managed investments ourselves, Nicole asking Margaret on a visit to Savannah 8 months ago, whether we'd thought about simplifying our assets as we got older. Margaret had mentioned it to me afterward, puzzled but not alarmed. I had filed it away as the kind of awkward conversation adult children sometimes have when they start thinking about parents aging. I had not connected those dots. A physician spends decades learning that the most dangerous diagnoses are the ones that look like something else for a long time. The symptoms that fit a benign explanation right up until they don't. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Raymond Cole. Raymond had been a colleague of mine at the hospital for 20 years before he retired. And before that, he'd spent 8 years as a forensic pathologist for the county. We still had lunch twice a year. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour, and when I explained the situation, I could hear him shift from social mode into professional mode immediately. The formulation matters, he said. If someone switched the pills, they'd need access to higher dose tablets. Metoprolol comes in 25, 50, and 100 milligrams. The shape and color are different between doses. Did Margaret notice anything different about her pills? I hadn't asked her that. I made a note to ask in the morning. The sustained nature of it is what tells the story, Arthur. An accidental single overdose presents differently. What you're describing is someone who understood the pharmacology well enough to know that incremental elevation would look like a worsening medical condition rather than poisoning. Someone with medical knowledge, I said. Or someone who did their homework. Raymond paused. You know what this is. I did know what it was. I just needed to hear it organized into words. Thank you, Raymond. You need me to talk to the detective. I'll talk to the detective. Margaret asked me the next morning, when she was clearer and stronger, whether I had noticed anything different about her pills before she left for Phoenix. I asked her what she remembered. She thought for a moment and said she'd refilled her prescription the week before she left, from the pharmacy she always used. The pills had looked the same as always. But 2 days into the visit, she said, she had noticed that the tablets seemed slightly smaller than she remembered. She had told herself that pharmaceutical companies changed their formulations sometimes, that she was probably imagining it. She had not been imagining it. Detective Okafor called me Tuesday morning. The warrant had been executed Monday evening. They had found 3 things that mattered. The first was an empty blister pack of 100 milligram metoprolol tablets in the bathroom trash, tucked underneath other waste in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately rather than dropped. The second was Nicole's laptop, with browser history that included searches for metoprolol overdose elderly, high blood pressure medication mixing, and how long does beta blocker toxicity take, the most recent of which was dated 11 days ago, 4 days before Margaret arrived. The third item was a receipt found in Nicole's car from a pharmacy 2 towns over, a pharmacy that was not their regular one, purchased 17 days before Margaret's visit. The prescription was for metoprolol 100 milligram tablets, a quantity of 60, written under a name that wasn't Brandon's or Nicole's. "We're running the prescription name now," Okafor said, but the receipt itself shows intent to obtain the medication outside their normal pharmacy and outside their own names. Combined with the browser history and the pill bottle from the hospital, we have enough to move forward. What does move forward mean at this stage? Arrest warrants, both of them. He paused. I wanted to tell you before it became public. I sat in Margaret's hospital room after I hung up and looked at my wife sleeping in the afternoon light. The monitors kept their rhythm. Outside the window, Phoenix went about its ordinary Tuesday in the dry, bright heat. I thought about Nicole. She and Brandon had been married 6 years. I had walked her down the aisle at their wedding when her own father was too ill to travel. I had paid for half the rehearsal dinner because they were young and starting out, and it was the right thing to do. I had liked her. I had trusted her in my home, at my table, with my wife. I thought about the 12 days Margaret had spent in their house, getting sicker every morning while taking what she believed was her medication, while Nicole brought her tea and said the elevation was affecting her, while Brandon said she just needed rest. I called my attorney. Gerald Hoffman had handled everything for Margaret and me for 19 years. Wills, property, a small medical malpractice matter in 2011 that never went anywhere. He was in his office and heard me through without interrupting. "First thing we do," he said, "is your estate documents. Today, are you where you can sign electronically? I can make that work. Brandon is currently the secondary beneficiary after Margaret, correct?" "Correct. We remove him. We need a new will drafted that redirects everything. I'd suggest a combination of a charitable foundation and a designated trust for Margaret's care. We also need a financial power of attorney review. Make sure Brandon has no existing access to any accounts." He didn't have access to accounts, but he knew what was in them. Margaret and I had been transparent with him over the years, in the way that parents are when they trust their children without question. We had told him things that we now realized we should not have told him. "What are we looking at financially?" Gerald asked. "The house, investments, retirement accounts, somewhere around $2.5 million in total." A pause. "That's a significant motive, Arthur." I knew it was. I had known it since the pill bottle. The arrests happened Tuesday evening. Brandon and Nicole were taken from their home in separate patrol cars. The charges were attempted murder in the first degree and conspiracy to commit murder. A third charge of elder abuse was added the following morning. I heard about it from Okafor. I did not see it happen. I was with Margaret when her nurse came in to check her vitals, and afterward, Margaret and I sat quietly for a while. She had known the arrests were coming. I had told her what I knew as I learned it, not because I wanted to burden her, but because she had the right to know, and because the alternative was lying by omission to the woman who had been with me for 41 years. "Tell me again what they found on the laptop," she said. Not a question, exactly. More like someone asking you to confirm a thing they still cannot believe. I told her again. The searches, the dates, the timeline that placed Nicole researching the overdose thresholds 4 days before Margaret arrived, which meant the plan had been in motion before my wife even packed her bag. Margaret looked at the window for a long time. Then she said, "She called me her second mother." I did not have an answer for that. I held her hand instead. The bail hearing was Thursday. Brandon and Nicole appeared via video from the county facility. The prosecutor argued for high bail, given the premeditation, the flight risk created by their financial situation, and the vulnerability of the victim. Their attorney, a defense lawyer named Garrett Flynn, argued that his clients had no prior record and deep community ties. The judge set bail at $300,000 each. Flynn had them out by Friday afternoon on a bond that pledged their house, which was the only significant asset they had left after I learned, through Gerald's research, the full scope of their financial situation. Gerald had engaged a private financial investigator within 24 hours of my call. The picture that came back over the following week was a precise accounting of how desperate things had become. Brandon had lost a substantial amount through a series of bad investment decisions, the kind that start with confidence and end with doubling down on losses. A tech startup in 2022 that failed. A cryptocurrency position that collapsed. Margin calls that cleaned out his brokerage account. He had borrowed against his 401k to cover the margin calls, and then borrowed from Nicole's mother to cover that. And by the time Margaret came to visit, they were 4 months behind on their mortgage and had 3 credit cards in collections. Nicole had called Gerald's office 11 months ago. I learned this from Gerald himself, who hadn't connected the name until he pulled his records. She had called posing as a general inquiry about estate planning, asking hypothetical questions about what happened to assets when someone died without a will versus with one, whether a spouse's inheritance could be transferred, how long probate typically took. She'd said she was asking on behalf of an elderly relative. Gerald had answered her questions professionally and thought nothing more of it. 11 months ago, she had been planning for nearly a year. Flynn's media strategy began the Monday after the arrests. I recognized it the way I had once recognized the early signs of a disease process. First, a sympathetic profile in the Phoenix New Times. Brandon and Nicole photographed in their living room, looking exhausted and frightened. The article presented their version with careful neutrality. According to them, Margaret had been confused about her medication since before she arrived. They had tried to help her manage it. They had been seconds from calling an ambulance, when a neighbor overreacted and made the situation worse than it was. The pills found in the trash were from an old prescription. The browser searches were Nicole doing research after the fact, trying to understand what was wrong with her mother-in-law. I read the article at Margaret's kitchen table in Savannah. She had been discharged 4 days earlier, and we had driven home slowly, stopping in New Mexico and Texas to let her rest. She was improving, but not at the rate I wanted. Her cardiologist in Savannah had her on a careful tapering protocol, and I was monitoring her at home with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 3 decades knowing exactly what to watch for. "They're going to say I was confused," Margaret said from across the table. She'd read the article over my shoulder. "They're going to try." I wasn't confused, Arthur. I knew something was wrong. I knew what my pills looked like. I knew I wasn't getting better the way I should have. Her voice was steady. "I know what I experienced. I know you do." I turned the tablet face down. "And the evidence is not on their side." I called Raymond Cole that evening. He had agreed to serve as an expert witness for the prosecution if needed, and he walked me through the medical evidence the way he used to walk juries through forensic findings. The sustained nature of the overdose, the presence of 100 milligram tablets in the bathroom, the pharmacy receipt, the browser history. Each item alone was explainable. Together they formed a pattern that had only one coherent interpretation. Gerald filed a civil lawsuit that same week. Attempted wrongful death, intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical expenses that had already reached $80,000 and were climbing. The civil action ran parallel to the criminal case, and its immediate practical effect was an asset freeze motion that Gerald argued successfully the following week. Brandon and Nicole's joint accounts, their small remaining investment portfolio, and their house were locked. They could not sell or transfer anything until the civil case resolved. Flynn responded with his own motion, claiming the freeze was designed to prevent them from mounting an adequate defense. The judge denied it. The evidence supporting the freeze was substantial. I spoke to Brandon once during this period. He called on a Thursday evening when Margaret was in the other room. I answered because I thought there might be something procedurally useful in whatever he said. He told me this was a misunderstanding. He told me Nicole loved Margaret like a mother. He told me that if I would just talk to Flynn, they could explain everything, and this would all become clear. And didn't I want to keep the family together? He said the word family 3 times in 4 sentences. I let him finish. Then I said that family was the reason I was pressing every charge available to me, because what he and Nicole had done was not something a family member did, and calling it a family matter was an insult to what the word meant. He hung up. Nicole's attorney filed a separate motion 2 weeks into the process. She was arguing that Brandon had been the architect of the plan, that Nicole had known something was wrong but had been afraid of him, that she was as much a victim as a perpetrator. It was a legally thin position given the browser history on her laptop and the pharmacy receipt found in her car, but it had the effect of splitting their defense. Brandon and Nicole were no longer presenting a unified story. Each of them was now pointing at the other. I had seen this before in my career, not in courts but in families. The moment the shared story starts to fracture, you learn what people are actually willing to sacrifice to protect themselves. The fracture happened faster than I expected. 3 weeks after the arrests, I received a call from the prosecutor assigned to the case, an assistant district attorney named Christine Yee, who had the brisk, organized manner of someone who had handled serious cases for a long time. Nicole's attorney had approached her office with an offer. Nicole was prepared to provide full cooperation and testimony in exchange for reduced charges. "What's she offering?" I asked. "Everything. Her version of how the plan developed, whose idea it was initially, the specific steps, when and where the pills were purchased, who replaced the contents of the bottle. She's also prepared to hand over text messages from a secondary phone we didn't find in the initial search." A secondary phone. I filed that away. "What's the offer?" "Conspiracy to commit attempted murder rather than the primary attempted murder charge. 8 to 12 years with the possibility of parole after 7. I thought about Margaret the morning I arrived at the hospital, her grip weak and her color wrong. I thought about 9 days of Tyler and Nicole watching my wife deteriorate while telling her it was the altitude. What happens to Brandon if she testifies? He faces the full charge without a cooperating co-defendant to contradict. The texts she's handing over apparently include messages where he explicitly discussed the dosage and timing. He becomes very difficult to defend. "Accept her offer," I said, "and make sure you ask her about the charger." The secondary phone produced text messages that the prosecutor described to me as devastating. Sent between Brandon and Nicole over the 3 weeks before Margaret's visit, the messages documented a plan that had been revised and refined like a project. They discussed the dosage, the substitution method, the timeline, how to explain Margaret's deteriorating condition to anyone who might notice. In one exchange, Brandon had done the math on how long it would take before Margaret's condition became critical at the elevated dose. Nicole had responded with a single word, "Good." I asked Christine Yee to read me that exchange over the phone, and I wrote it down in the same legal pad where I'd been keeping notes since the hospital in Phoenix. Then I sat in my study for a while and looked at what I'd written. Brandon had been 3 years old when I taught him to ride a bike on the sidewalk in front of our house in Savannah. He'd been 16 when I drove him to his first job interview and waited in the car to hear how it went. He'd been 36 when he called me from the hospital parking lot, crying, to say that the fertility treatments hadn't worked again and he didn't know how to tell Nicole. That was the person I had known. The person who had written "good" in response to a calculation of how long it would take his mother to die was someone else, or the same person, and I had not seen it. I did not know which of those possibilities was harder to accept. Margaret found me in the study that evening. She came and sat in the chair across from my desk, the way she had sat across from me in various studies and offices over 4 decades of marriage, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has earned the right to all your spaces. "You've been in here for 3 hours, she said. "I know." She looked at the legal pad. "The texts." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. I keep trying to find the moment where we failed him, where we went wrong, what we should have done differently. She looked at me steadily. I can't find it, Arthur, and I've been looking. Neither can I. Maybe that's not where the answer is. She straightened slightly in the chair. Maybe some people make choices that have nothing to do with what they were given. I thought she was right. I also thought that knowing she was right would not make the next part easier. Brandon's preliminary hearing was 3 weeks later. Nicole had signed her plea agreement by then, and the text messages were in evidence. Brandon's defense attorney mounted a competent argument that the evidence was circumstantial and that Nicole's testimony was the self-serving account of a co-defendant seeking leniency. It was the right argument to make given the circumstances. It wasn't enough. The judge found sufficient cause to proceed to trial on all counts. Brandon did not look at us in the courtroom. He sat at the defense table with his attorney and kept his eyes forward or down. At one point, when the text messages were referenced in the proceeding, his jaw tightened, and he looked at his hands. That was the only reaction. Margaret sat beside me in the second row. She had dressed carefully that morning, the way she dressed for things that required composure. When the judge ruled, she didn't move or change her expression. She was somewhere inside herself that I couldn't quite reach. Afterward, in the parking lot, she said she was glad she had come, that she needed to see it was real and moving forward, that she would not let herself be kept away from the process by the fear of seeing him. I told her she was braver than I was. She said that wasn't true. She said that coming to the hospital at 11 in the morning after driving 19 hours straight on a feeling was not something a person without courage did. The civil trial was set for 2 months after the criminal proceedings. With Nicole's plea in place and Brandon facing trial on all charges, Gerald told me the civil case was essentially resolved before it began. The asset freeze had been in effect for months. The house would go to foreclosure within the quarter. There was nothing of significant value left to pursue, which was why Gerald recommended we proceed quickly and establish the judgment on record rather than dragging it out. Brandon's trial lasted 4 days. The text messages were admitted without significant challenge. Nicole testified for 2.5 hours, precise and without apparent emotion, answering every question Christine Yee asked. She described the plan from its earliest stage, which had been a conversation Brandon initiated 8 months before Margaret's visit. She described the pharmacy 2 towns over. She described replacing the pills herself, carefully, over 30 minutes in the guest bathroom the day before Margaret arrived. She described the 9 days of watching Margaret decline and saying it was the altitude. The jury took 7 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Brandon's sentencing was on a Thursday morning in February. Margaret and I sat in the same seats we'd taken at every hearing. The courtroom was quiet and warmer than it needed to be. The judge, a careful man named Judge Whitfield, who had the manner of someone who took the weight of his work seriously, looked at Brandon for a moment before he spoke. "You had your mother in your home," Judge Whitfield said, "and you used that trust to administer a slow poison to a woman who had done nothing but love you. You watched her become sicker each day. You prevented her from seeking help by isolating her from the person who would have recognized what was happening. The only reason she is alive today is because a neighbor on your street noticed what you were hoping no one would see." Brandon's attorney had prepared a statement for him to read. Brandon read it in a flat voice, acknowledging the harm he'd caused, expressing regret. It contained all the right words and none of the right weight. The judge acknowledged the statement and set it aside. 22 years. Eligible for parole after 18. Margaret's hand tightened on mine when the sentence was read. That was the only response she allowed herself in the courtroom. Nicole was sentenced separately, the same afternoon. Her cooperation had produced the evidence that convicted Brandon, and the judge acknowledged that plainly. 8 years. Possibility of parole after 6. The civil judgment came 2 weeks later. Gerald had requested a figure that reflected Margaret's medical expenses, ongoing cardiac monitoring costs, pain and suffering, and the extended disruption to her health and daily life. The judge awarded $1.2 million. It was money we would never see. Brandon was in state custody. Nicole would be for years. Their house had already gone through foreclosure. There were no assets remaining to attach. "The point was never the money," Gerald said afterward. I know I said. Put it on record. It's permanent. If either of them ever receives an inheritance, wins a settlement, earns money beyond subsistence, we can pursue it. I thanked him and said I thought that was enough. Margaret's recovery continued through the winter and into spring. Her cardiologist in Savannah was cautious, but ultimately encouraged by her trajectory. She walked every morning, first just to the end of the block and back, then gradually further. She read. She tended the garden she'd been neglecting since fall. She called her sister in North Carolina every Sunday and talked for an hour. She did not talk about Brandon often. When she did, it was usually in the evening, when we were sitting on the back porch watching the light change. Not long conversations, short observations. She had been thinking about something he'd said when he was 12. She had dreamed about a vacation we took when he was in high school. She was trying to locate the person she remembered inside the facts of what he had done, and she was finding it difficult, which I suspected was the appropriate response, rather than a problem to be solved. I thought about what a colleague of mine had said once, years ago, after a particularly hard case. That grief doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it arrives wearing the clothing of something else. Routine, work, conversation. You think you're fine because you're functional, and then one morning you're in the grocery store, and you see a man about your son's age laughing at something on his phone, and you have to leave your cart and go sit in the car for a while. I had several mornings like that. Helen Marsh came to visit in late March. We flew her out to Savannah. It was Margaret's idea. She had spoken to Helen twice on the phone since the trial, and she wanted to thank her properly, face to face, in our home. Helen arrived on a Friday evening and stayed through Sunday. We took her to our favorite restaurant on the river Saturday night and stayed for 2 hours after the meal, just talking. Helen said she had asked herself, dozens of times since that morning she had stepped off her porch, whether she should have acted sooner, whether she should have called someone the first night as she heard Margaret's frightened voice through the wall, whether the 2 days of hesitation had cost Margaret something permanent. Margaret looked at her across the dinner table and said, with the directness that I had loved in her for 41 years, that Helen had done exactly what was needed at exactly the moment that mattered, that she had not hesitated when a stranger raised his hand to knock on a door, that she had said the words that changed everything, and that Margaret was sitting at a dinner table in Savannah because of them. Helen cried a little. Margaret passed her a napkin, and they moved on. Before she flew back to Phoenix, Helen mentioned that she'd been told the house next to hers was under contract to a young couple, new neighbors. She said she was glad that the house had been sitting empty since the foreclosure, and empty houses changed the feel of a street. I thought about how ordinary that was. A house sold, new people moving in, a street returning to its normal life. Inside what had been Brandon's house, 2 strangers would unpack their things and choose which room would be the office and argue gently about where to put the couch. They would meet Helen over the fence, and she would be a good neighbor to them, the way she had been a good neighbor before. The ordinary world continues. That is both the comfort and the difficulty of it. On a Wednesday evening in April, Margaret and I drove down to the waterfront and walked along the river. She wore the light jacket she always wore when the spring evenings were still cool off the water. We walked at her pace, which was slower than it used to be, but steadier than it had been in February. At a certain point, she stopped and turned toward the water. The evening light was doing something interesting on the surface. "Are you glad you drove to Phoenix?" she asked. It was not a question I had expected. "Yes," I said. "Obviously. I know why you did it. 19 hours on a feeling." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that. About what it means that you did that, without knowing for certain what you'd find, just because you knew something was wrong. 41 years, I said. You learn when something is wrong." She smiled at the water. "That's what I've been thinking about." She turned to look at me. "They thought they could isolate me, take away my phone, keep me in that room, tell me it was the altitude. They were trying to make me invisible." She paused. "But you knew. From 2,000 miles away, you knew. And you came." I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about the 19 hours on the highway, the dark phone in the cup holder that wasn't ringing, the way a silence can feel like a sound when you know someone well enough. "I'll always come," I said finally. It was not a dramatic statement. It was just the truth, said plainly, the way truths work best. She took my arm and we walked on. The river moved alongside us in the evening, indifferent and constant, carrying everything downstream toward wherever rivers eventually arrive. Above the city, the first few stars were beginning to show through the softening light. We had learned things in the past several months that no one should have to learn about their own family. We had lost something that couldn't be recovered and had never truly been what we believed it was. We had survived what had been designed to kill, and we had made sure that the design and the designers were documented, prosecuted, and held. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Ember Vengeance. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story of family, betrayal, or resilience, leave it in the comments below. I read every one. To hear the next story, click the box on the screen now. Thank you for being here.